Good day, everyone. Today, we dive into one of the most dramatic turning points of the late Roman Empire, a moment when a quiet scholar steeped in philosophy and ancient learning was thrust onto the blood-soaked stage of war. We're talking about Julian, a man never meant to wear armor, yet who led legions into battle and won. At the heart of our story is the Battle of Strasbourg in 357 CE, where the fate of Roman Gaul, and arguably the empire itself, was balanced on a knife's edge. This is not just military history, it's political intrigue, religious rebellion, and the last stand of pagan Rome. Let's step into this world and meet the man who dared to defy his destiny.
To understand why Julian's rise mattered, we need to step back and look at the state of the Roman Empire in the mid-4th century. The empire was fractured, politically and militarily. The East was bogged down in a bitter, grinding war against the Sassanid Persians. The West plunged into chaos after the murder of Emperor Constans by the usurper Magnentius. This wasn't just a military crisis, it was a dynastic one. The Constantinian family, once powerful and united, had torn itself apart in a storm of assassinations, coups, and betrayals. The Roman world needed stability, but all it had were emperors drowning in paranoia and frontiers collapsing under pressure. And it's in the middle of this mess that Julian, a young man with no command experience, is thrust onto the stage.
To understand why Julian's appointment was so shocking and so dangerous, we have to talk about his family, the House of Constantine. Constantine the Great, the man who legalized Christianity and moved the capital to Constantinople, left behind a dynasty soaked in blood. After his death in 337 CE, his sons and relatives began a brutal purge. Julian's father, a half-brother of Constantine, was executed. Many of Julian's cousins were murdered. The survivors constantly watched, always at risk. Constantius II, the most ruthless of Constantine's sons, emerged as the dominant ruler. But he ruled with deep paranoia, eliminating even potential threats, including his own family. So when he made Julian, a young philosopher in exile, the Caesar of the West, it wasn't just an act of desperation. It was a move that could backfire catastrophically, and Julian knew it.
So, who exactly was Julian, and why did his rise shock everyone? He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't even trained for leadership. Julian was a scholar, raised in exile, obsessed with Plato and Homer, fluent in Greek, and immersed in ancient philosophy. But behind the books was a young man marked by trauma. His father was murdered in the brutal purges after Constantine's death. He grew up in fear, far from court, watched constantly, and never allowed near the army or politics. And yet, in 355 CE, when Constantius II needed someone to save Gaul, he chose Julian. Historians still debate why. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe Constantius thought Julian could be easily controlled. But what no one expected was that this bookish outsider would become a natural commander, and eventually a threat to the very emperor who appointed him. Now let's shift our focus to the edge of the Roman world, the northern frontiers along the Rhine. This region had always been a dangerous boundary. To the south, the Roman Empire, stretched thin. To the north, a patchwork of fierce Germanic tribes in the land they called Germania. The Romans called their fortified boundary the limes, a network of forts, watchtowers, and roads. But by the mid-4th century, it was barely holding together. Every emperor dreamed of glory on this frontier and feared repeating the disaster of the Teutoburg Forest, where 3 Roman legions were wiped out by Germanic ambush. For Julian, this would become the proving ground. Gaul was in chaos. Germanic warbands were crossing the Rhine almost at will. And now this philosopher-turned-general would have to defend an empire where legends were made or lost.
On the other side of the Rhine stood a powerful and volatile confederation, the Alamanni. They weren't a single tribe, but a collection of Germanic warbands who had begun to unite during Rome's 3rd century crises. Their name literally means all men, a sign of just how diverse and dangerous they were. Fierce, mobile, and opportunistic, the Alamanni had taken Roman lands before. In fact, they had seized control of the region known as the Agri Decumates, a once Roman territory between the Rhine and Danube. By the 350s, sensing Rome's weakness after civil war and internal strife, they crossed the Rhine again, raiding cities, burning forts, and spreading panic across Gaul. Their most feared leader was Chnodomar, a towering warlord the Romans called Gigas, the Giant. Charismatic and cunning, he would become Julian's greatest challenge. To defeat the Alamanni wasn't just about winning a battle. It meant saving the Roman West from collapse. By the time Julian arrived in Gaul, the situation was already dire. The Alamanni had crossed the Rhine, not just in small raids, but in a coordinated invasion. Fortresses along the river, once proud Roman outposts, had fallen. Cities like Mainz, Mogontiacum, Seltz, Saliso, and Strasbourg, Argenteritum, were overrun. Roman garrisons were either wiped out or fled. Only Cologne, heavily fortified, still stood behind Roman walls. Across the countryside, brigands roamed freely, and the once orderly Roman roads became dangerous paths through lawless land. For many in the imperial court, Julian's appointment to Gaul was seen as a death sentence, a way to remove a potential rival by sending him into an unwinnable war. But Julian was about to surprise everyone.
In late 355 CE, Julian arrived in Gaul, a devastated land gripped by war, fear, and ruin. He was only about 23 years old. He had no military experience, had never commanded an army, and was best known for quoting Plato, not leading charges. To the hardened Roman officers under him, he was a joke, an academic forced into armor. Many whispered that he was just a sacrificial pawn, sent to fail or die, so Constantius could say, "At least I tried." But Julian didn't act like a puppet. He listened, learned, and, most importantly, led. He rode with his men, shared their food, learned the terrain, and built loyalty through presence, not orders. What began as a desperate assignment was about to become the making of a leader.
Julian wasn't just an unusual general. He was a religious rebel. Born into a Christianizing empire, he was educated by bishops, trained in the faith, even briefly served as a lector in the church. But secretly, Julian longed for something older, deeper, the gods of his ancestors, Zeus, Apollo, Dionysus. During his years in exile, he quietly devoured classical texts, Plato, Homer, and the Neoplatonists. He began performing private pagan rituals, studying ancient mysteries, and openly criticizing what he saw as the moral decay of Christianity. To Julian, the old gods represented order, wisdom, beauty, not suppression or blind faith. By the time he took command in Gaul, Julian had fully embraced paganism. But he didn't just believe in the old gods, he wanted to restore them. Not since the days of Augustus had a Roman leader tried to blend religion, politics, and military power so openly.
But here's the twist. The plan backfired. Julian didn't collapse under pressure. He thrived, and that made him even more dangerous in the eyes of the emperor. And this made Julian both inspiring and dangerous. Julian's biggest enemy may not have been across the Rhine. It might have been sitting on the throne in the east. Constantius II, the reigning emperor, was a master of palace politics, paranoid, calculating, and unafraid to eliminate threats, even family. So why did he send Julian, a young relative with no military experience, into the worst war zone in the empire? Some say it was a setup, a convenient way to remove a rival without spilling blood at court. Once in Gaul, Julian was starved of resources. Reinforcements were delayed or pulled back. A joint operation to crush the Alamanni fell apart when Constantius's general, Barbatiu, mysteriously withdrew and left Julian exposed. Ammianus Marcellinus, the Roman historian who served in Gaul, hints at this darker game. He suggests Julian was deliberately isolated, expected to die or fail. By the summer of 357 CE, the storm was ready to break. The Alamanni, led by their towering warlord Chnodomar, had gathered a massive force. They sensed weakness. They knew Julian's position was vulnerable, isolated, under-resourced. Meanwhile, Julian had expected help. A joint Roman operation had been planned. 2 columns, his own and another under Constantius's general, Barbatiu, were meant to strike the Alamanni together. But something went wrong. Barbatiu's forces were delayed, then withdrawn entirely. Whether by incompetence or political sabotage, the result was the same. Julian was left alone, deep in enemy territory. Chnodomar seized the opportunity. He mobilized tens of thousands of warriors, aiming to crush Julian in a decisive blow near Argentoratum, modern-day Strasbourg. Julian now faced overwhelming odds, outnumbered and unsupported. But he didn't retreat. He prepared to fight, and history was watching.
Let's pause for a moment and take in the battlefield. The year is 357 CE, near Argentoratum, modern-day Strasbourg. The Roman army, under Julian, is heavily outnumbered, facing a united Alamanni force nearly twice their size. The Alamanni, under Chnodomar, formed a deep and aggressive line, massed infantry with reserves ready to break through. They were confident, well-fed, and expecting an easy rout. Julian, on the other hand, positioned his forces with precision and boldness. On the flanks, he placed cavalry, including his elite cataphracts. At the center, hardened infantry legions held the line. In the rear, reserves and archers waited, ready to exploit any crack. Julian himself stayed mounted, unlike Chnodomar, who dismounted to lead on foot. That gave Julian mobility, the ability to observe and command the battle dynamically. Despite the odds, Julian's formation wasn't about brute strength. It was about flexibility, discipline, and rapid response. The battle was about to begin, and the first move would be a bold charge.
The battle began with a thunderous charge. Julian ordered his elite cataphracts, the heavily armored Roman cavalry, to smash into the Alamanni front line. These were fearsome warriors, encased in iron from head to toe. When they charged, it was like a human battering ram, in theory. But on that day, the terrain worked against them. The ground was uneven. The Alamanni line was denser and more ready than expected. The result? Disaster. The cataphracts took heavy losses almost immediately. One entire regiment even refused to return to the fight, despite Julian's personal pleas. Ammianus tells us that some of them were later punished by being paraded in women's clothing, a public humiliation for cowardice. It was a dangerous moment. A failed cavalry charge at the start of battle could have crushed Roman morale. But Julian stayed calm. He moved swiftly to reinforce the line, and the rest of the army held. The battle wasn't lost, but the stakes had just gotten higher.
After the failed cavalry charge, things got worse. The Alamanni infantry, emboldened and tightly packed, surged forward, and they broke through the center of the Roman line. In most battles, this would have been a catastrophic turning point. The center is the anchor. If it collapses, the whole army can be encircled or routed. But Julian had prepared for this. He had placed some of his best units, elite legions, in reserve, ready to react. At the critical moment, these units counterattacked, slammed into the flanks of the advancing Alamanni, and stabilized the breach. It was a moment of real danger, the kind that defines a commander. Julian stayed in the saddle, commanding, moving, calming his troops. He didn't just hold the line, he bent it, and was about to turn that bend into a trap.
Just when it looked like the battle might collapse, Julian counterattacked. From the rear, he unleashed his elite reserve legions, disciplined, battle-hardened troops who had been waiting for this exact moment. They didn't panic. They moved in tight formation, hit the flanks of the invading Alamanni column, and began to push them back. This wasn't just about holding ground. Julian began a tactical encirclement. As his flanks pressed inward, the Alamanni were being squeezed into a shrinking space. The center held. The wings curved in. The Roman formation became like a tightening vice. And suddenly, what had been a bold breakthrough for the Alamanni turned into a trap. The battlefield tipped. Now it was the Romans who had the momentum, and the enemy began to falter. Just when it looked like the battle might collapse, Julian counterattacked. From the rear, he unleashed his elite reserve legions, disciplined, battle-hardened troops who had been waiting for this exact moment. They didn't panic. They moved in tight formation, hit the flanks of the invading Alamanni column, and began to push them back. This wasn't just about holding ground. Julian began a tactical encirclement. As his flanks pressed inward, the Alamanni were being squeezed into a shrinking space. The center held. The wings curved in. The Roman formation became like a tightening vice. And suddenly, what had been a bold breakthrough for the Alamanni turned into a trap. The battlefield tipped. Now it was the Romans who had the momentum, and the enemy began to falter. As the Alamanni ranks crumbled, their king, Chnodomar, the giant, made a desperate bid for escape. He had led his people into battle with full confidence. Now, defeated and surrounded, he ran for the Rhine, hoping to reach a hidden group of boats. But Julian's cavalry was fast and relentless. Chnodomar was captured alive, dragged back from the riverbanks, and brought before the Roman camp. Imagine the moment. A towering warlord, once feared, now a prisoner, facing the very man he had tried to destroy. Julian spared his life, but not his freedom. Chnodomar was sent in chains to Constantius's court, and eventually to Rome, where he died in captivity on the Caelian hill. His fall marked not just the end of the battle, but the collapse of Alamanni hopes for supremacy on Roman soil. Julian's victory at Strasbourg was absolute. He had defeated a vastly superior enemy force, stabilized Gaul, and proven himself a commander not just by blood, but by brilliance. And then something happened that terrified the imperial court.
Julian's soldiers, overcome with loyalty and awe, hailed him as Augustus, not just Caesar, but emperor in his own right. This was political dynamite. To accept the title meant open rebellion. To refuse it could insult the army. Julian chose the middle path. He publicly rejected the title, reaffirming Constantius as the sole Augustus, for now. But the damage was done. Word reached the east. Constantius was suspicious. The seeds of a future civil war had been planted. Julian had won a great battle, but he was now walking a political tightrope, one misstep away from being labeled a traitor.
Julian could have stayed in the West. He could have ruled a restored Gaul, consolidated his power, and waited for Constantius to act. But he didn't. In 361 CE, with Constantius dead, Julian became sole emperor, and almost immediately he turned east. Obsessed with glory and eager to finish the war against Persia, he raised a colossal army, 65,000 men, and marched into Mesopotamia. At first, things went well. He won a battle near Ctesiphon, the Persian capital. But then disaster struck. Julian advanced too far, cut off his own supply lines, and found himself deep in enemy territory, harassed by Persian skirmishers. In June 363, near Samarra, a sudden ambush erupted into chaos. In the melee, Julian was mortally wounded, stabbed by a spear, possibly even by one of his own men. He died shortly after, just 31 years old. The campaign collapsed. His successor, Jovian, was forced to sue for peace under humiliating terms. And with Julian's death, so too died the last hope of a pagan revival, and the stability he had brought to the West began to unravel.
Julian's reign was short, just under 2 years as sole emperor. But his impact has echoed for centuries. He was Rome's last pagan ruler, and one of its most unusual. A man of letters who led armies, a philosopher in bronze armor, a pagan mystic in a Christianizing world. To pagans, he was a martyr for the old gods. To Christians, he was remembered, or reviled, as Julian the Apostate. But beyond religious debate, he represented something deeper, a final burst of classical Roman spirit before the curtain fell on the ancient world. He tried to restore the past while living in a rapidly changing empire, and for a brief, brilliant moment, he almost succeeded. His death marked not just the end of a campaign, but the end of an era. And so Julian stands in history as a paradox. A failure, yes, but a heroic one. And perhaps a tragic reminder that even emperors cannot stop the tide of time.